All right, so in this lesson, we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations by using the concept of square roots. So remember that every square root has two answers. So for example, radical 25, or the square root of 25, is not only positive 5, but it's also negative 5. So the square root of 25 is positive or negative 5. And this is a very important concept that we need to use when we are going to be solving these equations here. Another thing to remember is that not all square roots are perfect whole number answers like this. So if you have square root of a number like 30 that is not a perfect square, your square root of 30 is an irrational number, which remember is a decimal number that goes on forever without a repeating pattern. So in that case, what we'll do is we'll leave the answer in radical form, or if we convert this to a number, then we know that it's approximate because we need to round. So in this case, for example, we would round to nearest hundredth. So the square root of 30 rounded to nearest hundredth is approximately positive or negative 5.48. So if you do 5.48 squared, you don't get exactly 30, but you get a number very close to 30. So these are concepts that we need to remember, we need to use when we're solving these types of equations. So let's go ahead and take a look at our first example here. 4x squared minus 5 equals 2. So what we want to do here is we want to make sure that first we follow the steps that we usually follow for solving equations. So first I need to get rid of this negative 5. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. And I get 4x squared equals 7. Then I want to divide both sides by 4. And I get x squared equals 7 divided by 4 is 1.75. But I don't want x squared, I want x. So the square root of x squared is x. And so if x squared equals 1.75, then x is going to equal the square root of 1.75. And remember, the concept is that this is either going to be a positive or a negative number. Now, this here is your answer in radical form. In your lesson, they might ask you to split it apart. So you'll have two boxes that already say x equals, and then in one box you'll just write radical 1.75, and in the other box you'll write negative radical 1.75. We can also go the next step on this and go ahead and find the square root of 1.75 rounded to the nearest hundredth. And the square root of 1.75 rounded to the nearest hundredth is 1.32. Sorry. So we say x equals positive or negative 1.32. And again, in your lesson, they might ask for them separately. So in one box, you would put 1.32, and in the other box you would write negative 1.32. All right, let's take a look at our next example here. 2x squared minus 8 equals 0. So first, we're going to get rid of this negative 8. We're going to add 8 to both sides. We end up with 2x squared equals 8. Next, we're going to divide both sides by 2. We get x squared equals 4. And hopefully by now you've already recognized that 4 is a perfect square. So then when we say x equals plus or minus, positive or negative, radical 4, and we know that the square root of 4 is 2. So x equals positive or negative 2. And again, in your assignment, they might be split up into two different boxes. So in one box you would write 2, and in the other box you would write negative 2. All right, so let's do some practice here. Again, try to pause and work these out on your own, and then come back and see how you did. So number 4, 3x squared plus 6 equals 33. I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides. This gives me 3x squared equals 27. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 3. This gives me x squared equals 9. Then I want x, so x equals plus or minus, positive or negative, radical 9, and we know that 9 is a perfect square. So x equals, x equals positive or negative 3. All right, number 5. 5x squared minus 9 equals 2. First, I need to add 9 to both sides. This gives me 5x squared equals 11. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 5. And I get x squared equals 2.2, which is 11 divided by 5. So if x squared equals 2.2, then x equals positive or negative radical 2.2. And this is going to be an irrational number. So if I take this answer and I find the square root of 2.2 and I round it to the nearest hundredth, that is going to be x equals positive or negative 1.48. All right. All right, our next set of examples look a little bit different, but it's still the same basic concept. So if we look at example A here, we have x plus 5 squared equals 36. And this is the same concept. I don't want x plus 5 squared. I just want x plus 5, right? So I need to find the square root of both sides. So on my left, the square root of x plus 5 squared is just x plus 5. And on the right, this is the square root of 36 is positive or negative radical 36. And now that I've taken x plus 5 squared and I've taken it out of this parentheses with the exponent of 2, now I can get rid of this 5. So I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. Okay, and I get x equals positive or negative radical 36 minus 5. This is your answer in radical form, even though we could simplify radical 36, but I'm not going to do that here. Then we can go ahead and find the square root of 36, which is a perfect square. It's 6, so our answer is x equals positive or negative 6 minus 5. Now in this case, since our 6 can be either positive or negative, we can't leave this here. We have to keep working, and we have to actually split this up into two different equations. So my first equation is going to be x equals positive 6 minus 5, and my other equation will be x equals negative 6 minus 5. Now when I solve these, 6 minus 5 is 1, so x equals 1, and over here, negative 6 minus 5 is negative 11. So x equals 1 and x equals negative 11. All right, next example here. So now here we have 3 times x minus 5 squared equals 18. So first we got to get rid of this 3 so we can get in here, right? We got to get rid of this 3, so we have to divide everything by 3. This gives me on the left x minus 5 squared equals 6. Then I need to get rid of this square, so I'm going to square root everything. So on the left I have x minus 5 equals radical 6, positive or negative, radical 6. And then I can go ahead and get rid of this negative 5. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. And this gives me x equals positive or negative radical 6 plus 5. And again, 6 is not a perfect square, so I have to find the square root of 6 and then round to the nearest hundredth. So the square root of 6 rounded to the nearest hundredth is going to be 2.45. So I have here x equals positive or negative 2.45 plus 5. And again, I need to split these into two separate equations. So one equation is going to be x equals positive 2.45 plus 5, and the next equation is going to be x equals negative 2.45 plus 5. So here on the left, 2.45 plus 5 is 7.45. So x equals 7.45. And over here, negative 2.45 plus 5 is going to be 2.55. So x equals 2.55. And those are my two answers. Okay, go ahead and pause and try these on your own. Then come back. So over here, I want to get rid of this 4, so I'm going to divide everything by 4. And I get here x plus 10 squared equals 6. Then I need to get rid of this exponent of 2. So I'm going to get the square root of everything. So I have here x plus 10 equals positive or negative radical 6. And then next I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides. I get x equals positive or negative radical 6 minus 10. And we already know from the last question that the square root of 6 rounded to nearest hundredth is 2.45. So I get x, I really should do this every time I'm rounding. X is approximately positive or negative 2.45 minus 10. This becomes two separate equations. X is approximately 2.45 minus 10, and x is approximately negative 2.45 minus 10. So then on the left, 2.45 minus 10 is going to be x is approximately negative 7.55. And on the right, negative 2.45 minus 10, x is approximately negative 12.45. My approximatelys look kind of ugly here, huh? So let me fix them a little bit. So real quick. All right, that may be a little bit better. Let's move on to number 8. Over here, there's nothing to divide first, so I'm just going to get rid of this exponent of 2 by taking the square root of everything. So I have here x minus 9 equals positive or negative the square root of 64. Next, we have to get rid of this negative 9, so we're going to add 9 to both sides. We get x equals positive or negative radical 64 plus 9, and 64 is a perfect square, which is 8, and since it's a perfect square, we don't need to do approximately, so x equals positive or negative 8 plus 9. Then we're going to split these up into two different equations, so x equals 8 plus 9, and the other equation, x equals negative 8 plus 9. And 8 plus 9 is 17, so x equals 17. And negative 8 plus 9 is 1, so x equals 1. All right, last part, word problems. Let's go ahead and take a look at how this applies to some word problems. All right, so A, contractor is building a fenced-in playground at a daycare. The playground will be rectangular with its width equal to half its length. The total area will be 5,000 square feet. Determine how many feet of fencing the contractor will use. So remember, I always give the advice, whenever you see a problem like this involving shapes, just go ahead and draw yourself a diagram. So here's my rectangular playground, and they tell me that the width is equal to half its length. So let's say that the length is x. So if the width is equal to half its length, that means the width would be half x. Okay? And so what do we know, what do we remember about area of a rectangle? It's just length times width, correct? So area equals length times width. And in this case, the area would be x times half x. And that would equal x times half x is half x squared. And we know what the area is. It's 5,000 square feet. So my beginning equation for this, I'm going to write it over here, is going to be half x squared equals 5,000. So let's go ahead and solve this equation. So what would be my first step would be to get rid of this half. So remember, the way we undo multiplication by a fraction is by multiplying by the reciprocal. We flip and multiply. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 over 1. This gives me x squared equals 10,000. Then I don't want x squared, I want x, so I need to get the square root. So x is going to equal positive or negative radical 10,000, and 10,000 is a perfect square. The square root of 10,000 is 100. So I get as my answer x equals positive or negative 100. But remember, we've discussed how this is different a little bit in real world situations, because there's really only one answer here that makes sense, because we cannot measure real life things in negative length, negative distances. Therefore, we know that x cannot be negative 100. X just has to be positive 100. So if x is positive 100 and x is the length, so the length is 100, and half x, the width is half of that, so the width is 50. And you can see that works, because if you do 100 times 50, that gives you 5,000. So this is our correct answer right here. The length is 100 and the width is 50. All right, next example. A person standing on a second floor balcony drops keys to a friend standing below the balcony. The keys are dropped from a height of 10 feet. The height in feet of the keys as they fall is given by the function h of t equals negative 16t squared plus 10, where t is the time in seconds since the keys were dropped. The friend catches the keys at a height of 4 feet. Find the elapsed time before the keys are caught. So here we have h of t equals negative 16t squared plus 10. And in this case, h of t is 4. So I'm going to rewrite this, except I'm going to put h of t on the right end. So this is going to look like this. So negative 16 t squared plus 10 equals, and instead of h of t, I'm going to write 4. And let's go ahead and do the rest of this work here. So next, I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides. And I get negative 16 t squared equals negative 6. Then I need to divide both sides by negative 16. And I get t squared equals positive 3/8, which as a decimal is 0.375. Okay, so I'm going to write t squared, or t, because I want the square root of this. So t is equal to positive or negative radical 0.375. And the square root of 0.375 to the nearest hundredth is going to be t equals positive or negative 0.61. And again, in this situation, it's a real life situation, we cannot measure time in negative numbers or negative seconds. Therefore, negative 0.61 doesn't make sense. The answer is t equals 0.61. So it takes approximately 0.61 seconds for the friend to catch the keys. All right, last example. Go ahead and try this one on your own. Pause, try it on your own, and come back. A zookeeper is buying fencing to enclose a pen at the zoo. The pen is an isosceles right triangle. There is already a fence along the hypotenuse which borders a path. The area of the pen will be 4,500 square feet. The zookeeper can buy the fencing in whole feet only. How many feet of fencing should he buy? So we're dealing with an isosceles right triangle, which looks kind of like this. Now, if it's an isosceles right triangle, that means that these two sides are both the same measure, even though I didn't do a great job of drawing it here. So this side, the height of the triangle measures x, and the base here also measures x. And this is the hypotenuse, which we already have fencing for, so we only need fencing for here. And they tell us the area of the pen is 4,500 square feet. So what do we need to remember? We need to remember the formula for area of a triangle. So area of a triangle is half base times height. So in this situation, that means that it is half times x, which gives us the area of this triangle is half x squared. And now we know what the area is. It's 4,500. And I'm going to flip this so that, the answer, the final number is on the right-hand side. So this is going to look like this. Half x squared equals 4,500. Next, I want to solve this, so I want to get rid of this half. Again, we're going to flip and multiply. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2/1. And I get half x equals 9,000. Now I want to get the square root of this. So the square root of x squared is x. And so x equals positive or negative radical 9,000. And then I need the square root of 9,000. And look what it says. The zookeeper can buy fencing in whole feet only. So I want to round this one to the nearest whole number. So x equals positive or negative, and the square root of 9,000 rounded to the nearest whole number is 95. And again, I cannot measure things in negative numbers, so the answer is 95. X equals 95. And remember, there are two sides that measure 95, so that's 95 times 2 is 190. So the zookeeper needs to buy 190 feet of fencing.